Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Success Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here in the Writing Success Center, and today we're going to talk about tips and tricks for creative nonfiction. Too far. In this workshop, we're going to be going over what is creative nonfiction, the different forms of creative nonfiction, abbreviated as CNF, common elements and techniques, the 5 R's, and then we'll have some writing and reflection activities throughout the workshop. As always, to get the most out of this workshop, we recommend that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet that can be found in the module through which you access this video. This worksheet is also proof to your instructor that you completed a workshop, which will make you eligible for extra credit or completion of an assignment. And then lastly, we also encourage you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or went too fast. That's the beauty about these online workshops, is that they can really be taken at your own time, at your own pace. All right, so before we dive on into the content, I want to start us off with a little reflection activity. So on the worksheet provided for this workshop, type your response to the following reflection questions. Have you heard of the genre of creative nonfiction? If so, what is your understanding of it? What have you found interesting or elusive about the genre? So feel free to take a moment to just to write your response in the worksheet. All right, so what is creative nonfiction? So creative nonfiction is a literary genre, sometimes referred to as the fourth genre outside of poetry, fiction, and drama, which are the big 3. So it's this additional genre that's an umbrella term that basically uses literary styles to create factually accurate narratives. So it's very experimental and is used as a way to provide commentary on social and political issues, or sometimes even just as a means of reflection to provide insight on a certain thing that has occurred in your life. Common types of writing includes, but is not limited to, the personal essay, biography, narrative history, the lyric essay, visual essay, memoir, and literary journalism. So these are all common ways that we see creative nonfiction out in the world. And we're going to go over some of these, not all of them, but we're going to go through some of them later in just a bit. But yeah, basically creative nonfiction is a genre where you're retelling a factual story using literary techniques. So you'll definitely be taking elements of fiction and poetry in it. So some of the different forms, some of the most common forms that we see creative nonfiction appear to us is the form of the memoir, or commonly known as the biography and the autobiography, where it's a collection of memories, either through a single narrative thread or multiple ideas. And basically, very similar to a personal essay, you are providing insight into these personal experiences and just detailing what occurred and like what is the impact of that occurrence, how did it affect you in your life, etc. One thing that you should keep in mind about a memoir is that it should be personable and interesting, because it is a longer length form. It's typically a book, so anywhere from like 100 or more pages. So because of that, you want it to be personable and interesting so that folks are following along with your story. Then you have the personal essay, which is a shorter form of the memoir, but basically it's topics about personal experiences told using literary techniques. It could be a standalone story, but many braid true stories with extended metaphors and other narratives, and it is usually very emotionally charged. So the thing to keep in mind with both of these forms is that you are telling your own personal stories in some way. With the memoir, it might be your whole life story, and so that's why it's a little longer. Sometimes it's centered around a certain theme or a certain exploration or a certain framework. The personal essay might be a standalone memory that you're providing additional insight on, and seeing how that one standalone moment influences future things. Like I said, you can braid in extended metaphors or other ways for your reader to understand what it is that you're trying to say or the importance of this one standalone story. But both of these have to do with your own personal events or personal story. Another form is the lyric essay. So, it might have a similar subject matter as the personal essay. So, a single memory or a standalone um, part of yourself that you want to share. But it's a little more experimental in form. Kind of think of poetry. You know how poetry will often experiment with line breaks. There are certain forms that you can write poetry in, such as like the villanelle or the sonnet, etc. Lyric essays are basically how can you turn this personal story into, I guess, like a poem, because you're breaking away from what is like you are challenging the concept of what is prose, what are paragraphs, and like linear sentences. So it's a really great place to break barriers in language, be very experimental, and you're essentially letting the words arrange the format of the story. The format of the story provides insight as to how the poem should be, or how the story should be read, and like whether or not the page is also playing a role in it. And then lastly, we also have literary journalism, which is a report on real life events using literary conventions and styles. So kind of think of articles that you would read in the New Yorker or the Atlantic. Basically what you're doing is you're using these very literary techniques. So journalism is a lot more straightforward, it's cut and dry. You're reporting on things that are happening, and you are providing some insight, but typically the writing is straightforward. If you try to add any like too many metaphors, it's seen as flowery. Whereas literary journalism, you have the opportunity to be quote unquote flowery, which is the use of extended metaphors, the use of these literary techniques to make these real life events more interesting and make the reader feel more connected to them. So the thing about these two forms is that you have the opportunity to be more experimental and sort of challenge the traditional conventions that we see with an essay or with journalism, and sort of elevate it a little bit by adding some creativity to it. Some common elements and techniques of creative nonfiction. These are techniques that are taken from other genres, and this is what makes creative nonfiction creative. Because otherwise, if you're just detailing things that have happened, it's just nonfiction. But creative nonfiction, again, uses elements of poetry and fiction and drama in order to inform and make the story more interesting and more connected to the reader. So the first is narration, where the story is told with an effective plot and clear point of view. This is going to affect the structure of the story. And basically, there's a clear narrator. We know who the narrator is, similar to that of like a prose or fiction piece. We understand who is the narrator. Sometimes it's the first person, second person, third person, etc. And basically that narrator takes the reader through the events in an engaging way. So sometimes this narrator will give you additional insight that the characters in the story don't know yet, or sometimes they will only give you a little bit and expect you to start putting together the pieces before they give you the grand reveal. But regardless, there's a clear narration throughout the story. Another technique is observation. So it's not just enough. So with a common issue that I see with creative nonfiction is that beginning writers will often think like, I just have to tell you what happened. And they'll just give the big like details. However, creative nonfiction, you are an observer. You're an observer of your own memory, and you are taking the reader through all of these things that have happened, because they're not going to remember the little things. They're not going to know the little things. You know the little things. So it's your job as a writer to tell the reader what are those little things that have occurred. So you're going to situate the reader in the key details by appealing to all five senses, and share with the reader the small details that can be critical to the story. So for example, if the narrator is talking to a friend and the narrator mentions this one person and immediately notices that their friend's voice change or their body language got a little stiffer. They're immediately trying to change the subject. All of those are indications that the friend is suddenly uncomfortable. But if you're not sharing those little observations, the reader is not going to understand it. So it's your job as a writer to share all the little details, no matter how insignificant you think it might be. It might actually be more significant than you think. Braiding is a very common technique used in creative nonfiction where the writer intertwines multiple narratives or threads. Excuse me. It's helpful for longer stories in order to keep it more engaging and to sort of give the reader the sort of grounding element of what am I taking away from this piece. But basically, you might be using an extended metaphor or another idea to draw insight, to basically help the reader understand what is the takeaway, what is the thesis, what is the theme of the story. And so braiding is a really helpful way to do that. Braiding can occur in multiple different ways. It can occur by changing the point of view. So sometimes you might have one paragraph or one sentence that's in the first person, but then you switch into the second person as to show some sort of juxtaposition. Sometimes it means having this like long-standing motif of like the ocean and waves to show things constantly coming and going. So, if you're talking about like a breakup, one of my favorite metaphors to use is how oceans take away sand whenever they come into the shoreline. So in a way, sometimes breakups, people are taking something away from us. So that could be like an extended metaphor that I would use in if I were to be talking about in a breakup of a relationship, whether that's family, friendship, etc. So braiding just allows us to bring in these different insights and these different strategies in order to help the reader understand and gain insight on a certain topic. And speaking of insight is where the writer draws conclusions from the stories that they write. So the thing about creative nonfiction is that there's always some sort of takeaway, and there's some sort of conclusion that the writer tells the reader or implies to the reader. And good places to do this are where there's pauses in the story, where the narrator can delve into emotions, explain complex ideas, or draw strength and meaning. Kind of think of it as like the reflection portion of creative nonfiction, because there's a lot of reflection that goes into this form of writing. And sometimes the conclusion will surprise you, the writer, because sometimes you'll go into a story thinking that you know what the insight is going to be, but then you finish writing and you realize, oh, there was something new here. 5 R's. So there are 5 R's that help creative nonfiction writers sort of like understand what is supposed to go into the genre. The first is make sure that you're writing about real life, because it focuses on real people, events, and places. So it has to be centered on real life. Avoid fictionalizing it, because that is not the point of creative nonfiction. If you fictionalize it, it's fiction. You have research, so you want to make sure that you're learning about your subject to deepen and enrich your ability to relate the subject matter, especially if you're providing insight into politics or social science, or using an extended metaphor. So if you, for example, are writing about your 10th birthday, but it's really about how your 10th birthday happened on 9/11, you might want to do some research on 9/11 in order to make that correlation, because you need to make sure that you have an understanding of that topic. You want to make sure that you're writing a narrative, so you're using storytelling elements that we commonly associate with fiction to structure your piece's narrative as a story with literary impact. So you're not just retelling or recounting something, you're really telling a story. And then lastly, the last two R's are reflection. So there, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reflection that goes into these forms of writing, because you are going to be sharing your unique voice and perspective on the narrative you are retelling. So something that I always encourage you to do is, this is your story that no one else can tell. How will no one else be able to tell it? What specific insight can you provide that makes it uniquely your own? And then lastly, reading. So this is very common amongst all sorts of writing. One of my favorite poets, when I saw him speak, Ernesto C. Corral, said that he doesn't write every day, but he does make sure to read every day, because reading is what informs his writing. And the same goes for creative nonfiction. Reading is the way to see what works well and what can be improved on. It really just gives you different tools to strategize and experiment with. So it gives you the chance to see, to reflect on a writer's choices and see how it impacts us as readers. And again, just the opportunity to see what can we experiment with. All right. So now for our writing activity. So this is the opportunity to start brainstorming a potential topic that we would want to write about for creative nonfiction. So you're going to make a list of 5 things that you use either every day or throw away every day. Choose one item from your list and meditate from the perspective of a 5-year-old, from your 5-year-old self encountering this item for the first time. You can speak from an omniscient point of view, third person, directly from the point of view of your current self, self-reflecting, which is the first person, or speaking to your 5-year-old self as the second person, or you can speak from the point of view of yourself as the 5-year-old, which is also first person. Below are some guiding questions for your piece. How do they, the 5-year-old, use it? How do they explore it? What will they do with it? So in summary, creative nonfiction is an opportunity to share a personal story or anecdote in a creative way using elements borrowed from fiction and poetry to keep the story engaging. There's a clear narrative and often provides an insight into a lesson or takeaway. All right, so thank you. So that brings us to the end of this workshop. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, if you ever want some feedback, you're more than welcome to come into the Writing Success Center for some tutoring. And yeah, have a great day.